1. Exondia Salado. Exondia J. Salado moved through life with the confidence of someone who had worn a uniform, built a resume, and cultivated a capable public image. In Oklahoma City, neighbors knew her as a mother and an organizer in the household she shared with her husband, Manuel Manny Salado, an Army reservist just back from training. By the time a jury weighed the evidence, she was 39 years old and facing the gravest accusation a spouse can confront: the deliberate killing of her partner. Behind that composed exterior tension had been building for months. Their marriage carried ordinary stressors: money, worries, time apart, and the strain of relocation. But what pushed those pressures toward a breaking point was suspicion and jealousy. Prosecutors later argued that Salado believed Manny was being unfaithful and planning to leave, and the digital footprint investigators would uncover suggested methodical, brooding preparation rather than a momentary lapse. The portrait that emerged was not of a sudden snap, but of escalating control and anger converging on a catastrophic decision. The critical hours unfolded in early October in their Oklahoma City apartment. Prosecutors said Manny returned home late one night. Sometime after he walked through the door, Salado shot him. In the days that followed, they argued she destroyed evidence and transported what remained to an outdoor pit in a rural area. The specifics of those actions remain shrouded by the absence of a body. Despite extensive searches, Manny's remains were never recovered. The lack of physical remains would become a haunting centerpiece of the case, and a hurdle investigators had to clear in court. Detectives, however, built a case from what Salado did and said afterward. A friend told jurors that Salado admitted she had shot her husband and later burned the body. An ex-boyfriend testified she repeated a similar story to him, even changing details about whether Manny was asleep. Those statements were reinforced by forensics. A court record describes a host of searches on a computer linked to Salado, topics about spousal killing, dismemberment, body disposal, and a downloaded article chillingly titled about butchering a human body. Investigators also noted the family van's carpeting was suspiciously wet and smelled strongly of cleaning agents, and DNA testing tied biological material in the vehicle to a child of Manny's mother. Piece by piece, the timeline and choices painted a stark picture for the jury. The investigation began as a missing person search and quickly became a homicide inquiry. Reporters covered appeals for tips, including efforts to find a man who had briefly encountered Salado on a weekend when investigators believed she was seeking a rural dump site. The coverage underscored how prosecutors were pressing forward without the most traditional form of proof, a recovered body, and how crucial the digital and testimonial evidence would be. Her trial opened in late March and ran through the end of that month. The jurors heard the computer forensics, the testimony about her admissions, and the forensic findings from the van. They returned a verdict of first-degree murder and recommended life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a sentence the judge imposed. Appellate courts later affirmed the conviction and sentence. A federal court declined habeas relief years later, noting that she had a full and fair chance to litigate her challenges to the searches and the evidence. In short, review after review left the outcome intact. What motivated her? The state's theory was a volatile mix of jealousy, control, and premeditation, supported by the search history and post-crime behavior. Defense suggestions that Manny might have left for a new life abroad never found traction in the evidence presented at trial. Whatever personal hurts and suspicions existed in that marriage, the law draws a bright line: betrayal does not justify lethal violence. The careful, deliberate steps the jury found she took before and after the killing speak not to panic or self-defense, but to intent. The story is not about sensational details. It is about the irrevocable harm of one person's choices. Manny Salado was a son, a friend, a service member, and his absence remains a permanent wound for those who loved him. The court's judgment does not restore a life, but it does affirm a principle that cannot bend no grievance, no rumor, no fear of abandonment, ever excuses taking a life. Justice in this case required listening to the digital trail, the witnesses, and the quiet logic of the facts, and then saying clearly and finally that accountability must stand. 2. Lyndsey Dawn Fiddler. Lyndsey Dawn Fiddler was 26 years old when police in Bartlesville, Oklahoma arrested her after the death of her 10-day-old daughter, Maggie May. She was a young mother, living in a small downtown apartment known to family and neighbors more for personal turmoil than for any steady occupation. Reporters later noted a history of legal trouble and substance use that had already drawn the attention of child welfare officials before Maggie was born. In public, she could appear quiet and overwhelmed. Inside the home, instability was mounting. The backdrop to this crime was chronic addiction and a pattern of intervention that never fully took hold. State oversight records show multiple prior reports to child services about drug use in the home, concerns for older children, and worries about Fiddler's ability to provide safe care during pregnancy. Those reports documented red flags tied to drugs and repeated contacts with the family, yet the situation remained precarious. Addiction, poverty, and an overburdened system formed a combustible mix that left a newborn at risk. Everything came to a head in early November 2010. Maggie May was discovered inside a washing machine at the apartment, and the medical examiner ruled the death a drowning. Fiddler told investigators she did not know how the baby ended up there. A relative had come to check on the family and made the devastating discovery, sparking an investigation that gripped the community. Early drug screening showed Fiddler had methamphetamine and other substances in her system, a detail that the prosecutors later argued was central to what happened that night. The initial charges were severe first-degree murder and child neglect. As the case moved forward, investigators and prosecutors confronted evidentiary challenges, including limited blood samples that made it difficult to quantify the exact levels of intoxication. Even so, the broader picture was damning. An infant left in a dangerous environment, a parent incapacitated by drugs, and a sequence of poor decisions with irreversible consequences. The seriousness of the autopsy findings and the circumstances around the discovery drove the legal strategy on both sides. In late August 2011, Fiddler pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter and to child neglect. In court filings, she acknowledged that abusing methamphetamine and prescription drugs left her incapable of properly supervising her child. Prosecutors emphasized that while they did not believe she set out to kill Maggie May, her drug use directly led to the baby's death. That distinction mattered under Oklahoma law. Intent was not proven, but responsibility and causation were. The plea ended months of wrenching coverage and community anger. A Washington County judge sentenced Fiddler that October. The punishment effectively set a long road of incarceration and supervision, a prison term measured in many years, followed by a lengthy period of probation and close oversight. News accounts noted that the sentence was structured to keep her surviving children out of her custody well into adulthood, reflecting the court's focus on their safety. The ruling drew attention precisely because it balanced the absence of proven intent with the undeniable harm caused by drug-impaired neglect. The public response was raw. Community members voiced grief and disbelief. Relatives of the infant spoke about a tiny life they barely had time to know. The district attorney's office acknowledged the outrage and explained its reasoning, given the evidence securing accountability for neglect and manslaughter was the surest path to justice. For many in Bartlesville, the case also became a painful referendum on how addiction, poverty, and missed opportunities for intervention can converge into tragedy. Experts and officials who reviewed the case point to substance dependence as the central driver. Child welfare records documented repeated concerns about drug use. Investigators documented a positive drug screen after the baby's death. And Fiddler's own statement tied her impairment to her failure to protect her child. This is not a story of calculated malice. It is a story of impairment chaos and catastrophic neglect. That understanding may help explain behavior, but it does not excuse it. In the eyes of the law, and in basic moral terms, a parent bears an unshakable duty to keep a child safe. Lyndsey Dawn Fiddler's case stands as a stark warning. A baby's life ended, a family was shattered, and a community was left asking how so many warning signs could pass without a decisive life-saving change. Addiction may illuminate what went wrong, but it can never soften accountability for the harm inflicted. The sentence and the public reckoning that followed affirm a simple, necessary truth: society must protect its most vulnerable. And when that duty is abandoned, justice demands a clear, unequivocal response. 3. Skye Reece. Skye Reece was a young woman from Quappa, Oklahoma, 21 years old by the time a jury found her guilty and sent her case into the spotlight. At the time of her arrest the previous winter, she was 20 and living with her boyfriend and his children, more a day-to-day caregiver than someone with a defined occupation. Neighbors later told reporters they were stunned by what unfolded inside that modest home, a shock that rippled through Ottawa County. In the weeks that followed the child's death, investigators framed what happened not as an inexplicable accident, but as a pattern of abuse culminating in a fatal episode. Public records and courtroom accounts do not point to a formal mental health diagnosis for Reece. Instead, the picture that emerges is situational and volatile. Authorities noted inconsistencies in her account and signs that stress and poor judgment had overwhelmed any protective instincts that should surround a toddler. The events began in February of 2012, when emergency responders were called to the Quappa residence after Reece said her boyfriend's son, 17 months old, had fallen from a bed. The child was flown to a Tulsa hospital, and despite efforts to save him, he died shortly afterward. Reece lived in the home with the boy's father, and there was also a younger sibling in the household. From the start, investigators doubted the false story, and their skepticism only grew. As the investigation moved forward, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation joined local authorities. A physician who testified at a later hearing said the injuries reflected abusive head trauma rather than a low-height fall. Officials also noted the bed sat close to the floor and that the room was carpeted, details they argued undercut any claim of a tragic mishap. The medical findings would become the backbone of the case the state built against Reece. By late December of 2012, an Ottawa County jury returned a verdict of guilty for first-degree murder by child abuse. News accounts noted that deliberations were brief, underscoring how decisive jurors found the medical testimony and the physical evidence. Reece had continued to say the boy slipped from the bed, but the state emphasized the severity and pattern of the injuries. The courtroom, packed with relatives and community members, absorbed the verdict in heavy silence. Sentencing came in early February of 2013. The jury recommended life in prison with the possibility of parole, and a judge agreed. Prosecutors reminded the public that under Oklahoma law, anyone convicted of first-degree murder must serve at least 85% of the sentence before being considered for parole, a threshold that places parole far beyond the near horizon. For the child's family, the announcement brought grief and a measure of solemn vindication. What motivated her in court? The state argued that Reece responded to stress and responsibility with anger that turned into abuse, while Reece herself insisted on an accident. There is no credible record of a psychiatric condition that would explain away her actions, and experts who reviewed the case for the prosecution focused on the mismatch between her account and the medical evidence. In the end, jurors accepted the state's view that this was a violent crime against a defenseless child. The final judgment stands as a stark condemnation. A toddler's life ended a family fractured, and a community learned again how vigilance must surround its youngest members. Whatever pressure lived inside that home, it does not lessen accountability. The law responded with clarity, and rightly so. Justice here is not about spectacle. It is about a promise society makes to its children. When that promise is broken, consequences must be certain, and the memory of the victim must be honored. 4. Amber Michelle Hilberling. Amber Michelle Hilberling was in her early 20s when a Tulsa County jury judged her responsible for the death of her husband, Joshua Hilberling. At the time of the incident, she was a 19-year-old expectant mother living with Joshua in a downtown high-rise, more recognizable as a young spouse than as a professional with a defined career. Friends and neighbors later described a relationship that could swing from affectionate to tense, and court filings would paint a portrait of a couple too young and too volatile to withstand the pressure building inside their apartment. Trouble had been brewing long before the fatal confrontation. Prosecutors and reporters noted a tumultuous bond with allegations of conflict from both sides and hints of prior domestic strife. In one account, officials described the relationship as volatile, a word that would return again and again in coverage of the case. Pregnancy, financial stress, and an argument that escalated too fast formed the backdrop to what happened next. None of these factors excuse the outcome, but they help explain how a heated moment crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. The crisis erupted in early summer of 2011 inside the couple's apartment at the University Club Tower. During a fierce argument, Amber shoved Joshua. He crashed through a window and fell to the roof of a parking structure far below. She later told first responders she tried to grab his foot and never meant to kill him. Witnesses said they saw him come out of the window upright and face forward. A maintenance worker recalled hearing glass break and then hearing Amber scream words to the effect of, "I killed my husband." From the beginning, she insisted she acted in self-defense and never imagined the window would fail. Investigators and prosecutors rejected the accident narrative. They pointed to the medical and scene evidence, the accounts of witnesses, and Amber's own statements to emergency personnel. A judge later released key materials shown to jurors, including a recording of Amber in a police room with her grandmother, emotionally talking through what had happened before she had a lawyer present. The evidence package, coupled with testimony about what bystanders observed, shaped a trial that moved swiftly once it began. At trial, in March of 2013, jurors found Amber guilty of second-degree murder. Days earlier, she had declined a plea offer that would have meant a handful of years in prison. After the verdict, the jury recommended a sentence measured in decades. The judge followed that recommendation, imposing 25 years behind bars. Reporters at the courthouse noted the stark pivot: a young mother who gambled on acquittal and instead faced a long term of incarceration. Appeals did not change the outcome. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction the following year, rejecting arguments about evidence and counsel. Public interest in the case persisted with debate over self-defense claims and the quality of representation, but the legal record remained intact. Years later, the story took another tragic turn when Amber died in state custody. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide, and the Department of Corrections confirmed she was found in her cell at the women's prison in McLeod. Families on both sides voiced grief, anger, and exhaustion, closing a chapter that had already cost them more than words can cover. What motivated her in that apartment was the central question for jurors. Prosecutors argued anger and recklessness, not a defensive struggle, drove the push. The defense said fear and a history of conflict led her to act, and that she never anticipated the fatal consequence. The jury's decision makes clear which narrative the law accepted. Whatever pressures, immaturity, or relationship turmoil were in play, none rose to a legal justification for ending a life. This case should be remembered with moral clarity. A young man died a child, lost a parent, and an extended family carries a wound that time cannot fully heal. The court's judgment delivered accountability, and that accountability matters. Domestic conflict is never an excuse for lethal harm. When temper and force replace restraint and responsibility, the outcome is devastation. The lesson is simple and unforgiving. Walk away, seek help, protect life. Justice demanded consequences here, and society is right to condemn the choice that shattered a family and a community. 5. Rebecca Bryan. Rebecca Becky Bryan was in her early 50s. A suburban real estate agent and the wife of Nichols Hills Fire Chief Keith Bryan, when a late-night emergency call from their Mustang, Oklahoma home set a tragedy in motion. In public, the Bryans looked like a long-married couple rooted in their community. At home, prosecutors later said the marriage was strained with arguments that friends had noticed and a distance Keith's colleagues could not have guessed. That contrast between the calm exterior and private turmoil would become central to the courtroom story that followed. Behind the scenes, investigators and later jurors heard about a relationship that had frayed. Prosecutors alleged Becky had carried on an affair with a real estate broker from Hugo and was fixated on rekindling it. Court records and testimony described calls and voicemails to the former lover and statements about inheriting money and starting fresh somewhere new, a picture of desire, resentment, and opportunity converging. There was also the lingering fact of an earlier divorce filing that was never finalized. The state would argue that these threads formed a motive romance revived, and finances improved through a life insurance payout. The fatal night arrived in late September of 2011. Becky called 911 and claimed a stranger had slipped in through the garage, confronted Keith as he sat on the couch, and fired a single shot before apologizing and saying the chief should have hired him. It was a dramatic story that sent officers racing to find a gunman on the loose. But as detectives walked the rooms and mapped the route Becky described, they began to see details that did not fit an intruder narrative. In the laundry room, investigators opened the clothes dryer and found a handgun, a spent casing, and a glove. A matching bullet was lodged in the couch where Keith had been sitting. The utility room, they noted, was not on the simple in-and-out path Becky had given them. That discovery quickly shifted attention toward the person who had made the call. The gun and casing were processed. The firearm was linked to the projectile recovered from the couch. From that point, detectives treated the dryer cache as the most telling clue of all. The case reached trial in Canadian County in May of 2013. Jurors heard about the discovery in the dryer, the bullet in the couch, the timeline of calls to the former lover, and the claim of a phantom intruder. They also heard that Becky had portrayed herself as a frightened witness, not a perpetrator. After deliberations, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. Weeks later, a judge imposed the punishment the jury recommended: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Reporters in the hallway captured the raw mix of grief and anger from family and firefighters who had come to see the verdict delivered. Appeals followed, but did not change the outcome. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction the next year, leaving the trial court's judgment intact. The case continued to draw attention, resurfacing in national true crime programming and local retrospectives that revisited the evidence and the competing narratives of fear versus calculation. Through it all, the official record remained a conviction for first-degree murder and a life without parole sentence. Psychologically, the state characterized Becky's actions as a blend of resentment, entitlement, and an urgent wish to escape a marriage while preserving social standing and gaining financial security. Testimony about the affair and the references to life insurance were presented as the accelerants that turned tension into a lethal choice. The defense countered that she was a panicked spouse who had invented nothing, and that investigators misread a chaotic scene. Jurors, weighing motive alongside the physical evidence hidden in plain sight, chose the prosecution's view. This story should end with clarity, not ambiguity. Keith Bryan was a public servant who earned his community's trust. He deserved safety in his own home. The court's decision affirms a basic principle: when intimate betrayal leads to deadly harm, the law must answer decisively. Whatever unhappiness lived inside that marriage, it could never justify ending a life. The verdict and sentence stand as a reminder that truth has weight, evidence matters, and justice, though it cannot heal. Every wound can still speak for the victim and for the community he served. 6. Mary Courtney York. Mary Courtney York was barely out of her teens when Norman police tied her to a deadly home invasion that left Patrick Burton, a well-known neighbor in his early 50s, dead inside his burning house. She came from Del City, and by accounts in early reports did not have a steady occupation that anchored her days. Friends of the victim described Burton as generous and friendly, the kind of man who knew people in his neighborhood. York's public image before the crime was largely a blank to the broader community, but detectives would soon fill that silence with a timeline and a motive that pointed straight to her and an older boyfriend, Christopher Cody King. In the months leading up to the fire, York's life appeared unsettled. Court filings later referenced drugs in the background and a relationship dynamic prosecutors described as coercive and chaotic. Her attorney would claim she feared King. Investigators, however, focused on a simpler driver money. In an affidavit, police wrote that York admitted she knew Burton, that he sometimes gave her cash, and that on the night of the killing she followed him to a bank. What began as a plan to take advantage of a perceived kindness, authorities said hardened into a violent robbery plot. None of those circumstances excuse what followed, but they help explain the pressure points that prosecutors believed pushed this case toward tragedy. It happened in mid-February of the early 2010s inside Burton's home in Norman. According to investigators, York and King went there to rob him. Burton fought back. During the struggle, he was shot and the house was set on fire as the pair tried to erase what they had done. Even the family dog did not survive the blaze, a detail that deepened the community's grief without changing the essential facts that mattered in court. The picture the state presented was stark. A trusted acquaintance used that trust to help open the door to an attack from which there was no return. Police work closed in quickly. Officers recovered Burton's truck and items taken from his home at another address, leading them to York and King within days. Initial booking records listed York as 19 at the time of arrest and King as a few years older. From there, the paper trail moved steadily, formal charges, a case file that emphasized robbery and arson as part of the same violent episode, and a plea from York that acknowledged responsibility without forcing a jury trial. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and arson in state court. A Cleveland County judge imposed a life sentence with all but 23 years suspended, and under Oklahoma law, she must serve at least 85% of that 23-year term before any parole consideration. King tried separately, received a life term. For Burton's family, the announcements brought sorrow and a measure of closure. Prosecutors described York's motivation as a mix of financial desperation and the influence of a partner who shared both the plan and the willingness to carry it out. The defense tried to reframe her as fearful and manipulated, pointing to substance use and the imbalance inside the relationship. Jurors never weighed those competing narratives because the plea ended the trial phase, but the sentencing record speaks to how the court read the evidence, a robbery that ended in a killing, and an intentional fire set to hide it. In that reading, York was not a bystander swept along by events. She was an active participant who knew the man at the center of the plot and exploited his trust. This case demands a clear moral conclusion. Patrick Burton was a neighbor and a son described as generous with people who asked for help. That generosity was betrayed in the most devastating way. Whatever instability, fear, or intoxication hovered around York's life, none of it lessens accountability for a life taken and a home destroyed. The court sentence ensures a long stretch of incapacitation and stands as a warning about how quickly greed and indifference can eclipse basic humanity. Justice here cannot restore what was lost, but it can affirm a simple principle: we do not excuse the deliberate choice to harm. We confront it, condemn it, and protect the community that was left to mourn. 7. Chloe Marie Thomas. Chloe Marie Thomas was a teenager from the Oklahoma City area when police tied her to the disappearance and death of Anne Josette Hill, a high school student from Piedmont. Thomas was 19 years old by the time a jury weighed the evidence against her. Before the crime, her public profile was that of a restless adolescent living on the margins of steady work or school. Anne Hill, 16 years old, was known by loved ones as bright and social, a girl whose sudden absence would shake her family and community. The contrast between their paths set the stage for a case that would come to symbolize youthful choices hardened into adult consequences. Prosecutors later told jurors that the motive was simple and chilling: robbery. They argued that Thomas and a male acquaintance, Chad Philip Raymond, then 18, set out to take Anne's car and money. Nothing in the public record suggests a formal mental health diagnosis for Thomas, but the state described a pattern of impulsivity and deception, the kind of escalating risk that can follow troubled relationships and easy rationalizations. According to the state's theory, opportunism and the influence of an older partner became the fuse that lit a catastrophic plan. On the evening of April 11, 2014, Anne agreed to meet at an Edmond apartment after being lured under false pretenses. Investigators said the pair intended to rob her, and when the plan unraveled, the encounter turned deadly. The state maintained that Ann was strangled and her body taken to rural McLean County and left there. Ann's car was later recovered at Fink Park in Edmond, a discovery that deepened the mystery and energized the search. For months, family private investigators and law enforcement worked across fields and back roads, holding out hope for answers that seemed just out of reach. A year later, a break arrived far from any courtroom. A seismography work crew in McLean County came upon human remains, and authorities confirmed they were Ann Hill's. That find shifted the investigation from a missing person case to a homicide anchored by physical evidence and new witness statements. Detectives traced communications, reconstructed movements, and gathered testimony that placed Thomas and Raymond at the center of a planned theft that spiraled into murder. In the pretrial phase, investigators said Thomas had admitted helping move the body, even as she minimized her role in the killing itself. Trial began in mid-November 2016. Jurors heard how Thomas and Raymond lured Ann to the apartment, and they listened as Raymond, who had already accepted a plea agreement, testified for the state. Prosecutors argued that both shared responsibility. The defense tried to cast Thomas as a frightened participant who helped after the fact. The jury rejected that view. They found Thomas guilty of second-degree murder. In late December, a judge imposed life imprisonment. Raymond, who cooperated, received a 35-year sentence. For Ann's loved ones, the verdict brought a measure of closure wrapped in the ache of what could never be restored. In assessing motive and mindset, the prosecution emphasized greed manipulation and a willingness to treat a peer as a target rather than a person. They said Thomas lied to gain access, facilitated the attack, and helped conceal it all to profit from a car and cash. Whatever pressures or immaturity colored her life, experts for the state framed her choices as intentional, coordinated, and sustained. The court's sentence reflects that reading accountability measured not only by a single violent act, but by the planning and the cover-up that followed. This story must end with moral clarity. Ann Hill was a daughter and a friend whose future was stolen for selfish gain. The community searched, mourned, and then watched as the justice system gave voice to the truth the evidence established. There is no justification for luring someone into danger, no excuse for taking a life and trying to hide it. The law answered firmly, and that answer matters. It reminds us that predators can look like peers, that choices carry weight, and that justice, though it cannot return the lost, can stand up for them with certainty and resolve. 8. Phasasha Ann Garcia. Phasasha Ann Garcia was a young woman from Lawton when her name first entered the headlines, 19 years old at the time she surrendered to police. She did not have a public-facing occupation that drew attention. To most people, she was a familiar face around town, not a figure of controversy. That changed after an altercation at a veterans hall on the east side of the city ended with a man dead and a community stunned. In the hours leading up to the shooting, witnesses described tension that flared into a personal argument. Accounts gathered by detectives pointed to jealousy and tempers running hot, the kind of impulsive moment that can turn reckless when pride and provocation take over. Investigators later told reporters that the clash centered on another woman, a detail that framed the encounter as emotional rather than random. None of that turmoil excuses what followed, but it helps explain why the evening spiraled so quickly. The crime unfolded in mid-April of the late 2010s at Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 5263 in Lawton. During the argument, Garcia produced a handgun and fired, striking Rory Martin. The scene was chaotic, with bystanders shocked by how quickly a dispute had erupted into irreversible harm inside a place meant for camaraderie and support. First responders converged, but the damage was done, and the night that began as a social gathering became the center of a homicide investigation. Detectives interviewed witnesses who said they had seen the confrontation and the shot. Some recalled provocative words moments beforehand and described a back and forth that escalated beyond any chance of de-escalation. Within days, police obtained an arrest warrant. Garcia turned herself in and made a first appearance before a judge. She was initially booked on a charge of first-degree murder, and a judge set bond at $1 million. The swift sequence from warrant to surrender signaled that investigators believed the evidence was straightforward and anchored by multiple eyewitnesses. The legal outcome arrived nearly 2 years later. In late January of the early 2020s, the charge was reduced in state court to second-degree murder, and the judge imposed a sentence of 25 years with 20 years suspended. In practical terms, that structure left a limited period to serve in prison, followed by a long span of supervision. Local news coverage emphasized that she had been originally charged with first-degree murder, but the amended charge carried a punishment that balanced accountability with the plea-driven resolution of the case. Prosecutors characterized Garcia's actions as the culmination of anger impulsivity and a willingness to reach for a weapon in a volatile setting. The defense position, to the extent it surfaced in public reporting, centered more on the heat of the moment than on any long-standing plan. There is no public record of a formal psychological diagnosis that would account for the decision to use deadly force. Instead, the state's theory turned on human factors we recognize all too well: jealousy-wounded pride and an inability to step away. Those dynamics, prosecutors argued, transformed a social dispute into a lethal choice. The families and the wider community carried the aftermath. A man lost his life. Friends from the Veterans Hall and relatives mourned a person they expected to see again the next day. For them, courtroom milestones could only mark accountability, not restoration. The sentence did, however, draw a line that the law must draw when someone answers an argument with a firearm. Society answers with consequences designed to protect the public and to honor the value of the life that was taken. This case ends with a clear moral truth. A grievance in a public hall became a fatal act because someone chose force over restraint. Whatever the emotions of that night, they can never justify ending a life. The court's judgment reflects that reality. It is a sober reminder to walk away, to let tempers cool, and to keep weapons out of confrontations. Justice cannot undo the loss, but it can speak plainly. Life is not negotiable, and choosing violence will meet a firm, unambiguous response. 9. Alanna Jean Orr. Alanna Jean Orr was a grandmother from Oklahoma City, a member of the Kickapoo tribe, and in her late 40s at the time of the offense. By the time she stood in a federal courtroom to admit what she had done, she was 50 years old. There was no notable public persona around her. To most, she was a caretaker who sometimes watched her grandson. That ordinary image shattered after a summer afternoon in Hara, when a day that should have been routine ended with a child's life lost and a family forever changed. Prosecutors later described a choice rooted in selfish impulse and catastrophic disregard. There is no public record of a clinical diagnosis that might explain her behavior. Instead, the state focused on a sequence of decisions that prioritized gambling over caregiving and ignored obvious danger. In legal filings, the government said Orr willfully failed to provide basic shelter and supervision to a child entrusted to her care. It was, they argued, an act of profound negligence compounded by hours of inattention. On a June afternoon in the late 2010s, Orr drove to the Kickapoo Casino in Hara with her 5-year-old grandson. Surveillance video later showed her entering and staying for roughly 6 hours while the child remained in the car without air conditioning. The day's high approached 90 degrees, turning the vehicle into a trap. About 15 minutes after leaving the casino, Orr called 911 and told dispatchers the child had choked and was not breathing. Officers met her at the Hara Police Department and tried to resuscitate him, but noted that rigor mortis had already begun. What happened in those hours was not hidden in mystery. It was recorded in timestamps, temperature, and the irreversible physiology of heat. Federal jurisdiction attached quickly. Because Orr and the victim are native, and the offense took place on tribal trust land, the case fell under federal law. A grand jury returned an indictment for felony murder in the second degree by child neglect in Indian country. The charge captured what investigators believed the evidence showed: not an accidental lapse or an unforeseeable tragedy, but a willful failure of care that resulted in death. Facing that evidence, Orr appeared before a United States district judge and pleaded guilty. In open court, she admitted she caused her grandson's death by leaving him unattended on a hot summer afternoon in the back seat of her car with no air conditioning. The sentence arrived the following summer. A federal judge imposed 210 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and ordered Orr remanded immediately to begin serving her term. The United States Attorney's Office emphasized that the boy had been left alone in summer heat for hours, and that the call for help came only after Orr left the casino. For the family, courtroom milestones brought a measure of accountability, but no relief from grief. Local coverage echoed the public's outrage and sorrow, focusing on the preventable nature of the loss. In assessing motive and mindset, prosecutors stressed indifference, not insanity. Selfishness, not sudden confusion. They pointed to the predictable risk of leaving a child in a sealed car on a hot day and the long stretch of time during which help could have been sought but was not. Whatever personal pressures or habits led Orr to that parking lot, none rose to justification. The law saw the act for what it was, a deliberate abandonment of duty that cost a child his life. This case demands a firm, unambiguous conclusion. A young life ended because an adult chose a convenience over care and chance over caution. There's no excuse, no mitigating narrative that can soften that truth. The sentence stands as a necessary response and a warning. Children cannot protect themselves from heat neglect or indifference. It is the obligation of every caregiver to do so without fail. When that obligation is abandoned, justice must answer clearly, and society must say with one voice that such betrayal of trust will not be tolerated. 10. Brittney Poolaw. Brittney Poolaw was in her early 20s when a Comanche County jury found her guilty of manslaughter in the first degree after the loss of a pregnancy. At the time of trial, she was 21 years old, living in Lawton, unemployed and largely unknown outside her circle of family and friends. Records, introduced in court and later reporting, described a difficult personal history. She had spent time in foster care, struggled after aging out, and lacked identification that might have helped her access services through her tribe. Poolaw is a citizen of the Wichita and affiliated tribes. That quiet, complicated life became the focus of statewide and national attention once prosecutors argued that her substance use during pregnancy turned a private medical emergency into a crime. In the state's telling, the trigger was not a sudden rage or a long-nursed vendetta, but a pattern of harmful choices shaped by addiction and instability. Poolaw told investigators she sometimes used methamphetamine to feel numb, a statement that prosecutors would later frame as evidence of reckless disregard for fetal life. There was no clinical mental health diagnosis presented to justify her conduct. Instead, the narrative centered on stress-limited resources and substance use that had gradually taken precedence over care. Those pressures do not excuse criminal behavior, the state argued. They explain how it escalated. The events that brought her to court began in the first days of the year 2020, when Poolaw experienced a miscarriage at roughly 17 weeks gestation and sought emergency care at a Lawton hospital. According to trial testimony, the medical examiner later reported multiple possible contributors to the pregnancy loss, including a placental complication and a congenital abnormality, and could not say with certainty that drug use was the direct cause. Prosecutors, however, urged jurors to view her methamphetamine use as the central factor. The case, already fraught with emotion, turned on how to interpret a complex medical picture and where to place responsibility. Detectives moved quickly. Within days, Poolaw was arrested and charged with the first-degree manslaughter. She remained in jail for about a year and a half before trial because she could not afford bond. In the courtroom, jurors heard that the fetus was in the second trimester. They also heard that toxicology found controlled substances, even as the state's own expert acknowledged the limits of linking those results to the miscarriage. After a one-day trial in early October of 2021, jurors deliberated for less than 3 hours and returned a guilty verdict. The judge imposed a 4-year prison sentence. Reporting later noted she had declined an earlier plea offer measured in well over a decade, choosing instead to let a jury decide. Public reaction was immediate and polarized. National outlets, advocacy groups, and medical organizations questioned whether Oklahoma law supported prosecuting a woman for a miscarriage occurring far short of viability and whether criminalization would deter people from seeking medical help. Prosecutors countered that Poolaw knowingly endangered fetal life with illegal drug use, and that the jury's verdict reflected community standards as well as the evidence. Her case came to symbolize a broader legal trend in which pregnancy outcomes are scrutinized through a criminal lens with far-reaching consequences for families and public health. As to motivation, the prosecution's theory was stark substance use took priority over duty, and that reckless disregard met the legal definition of manslaughter. Defense arguments emphasized ambiguity in the science and the absence of proof that drugs caused the loss. No expert testimony established an intentional aim to harm. The legal question was whether negligence rose to criminality. Jurors answered yes, and the sentence reflected that judgment. Whatever the surrounding hardships, the court concluded that Poolaw's choices crossed a bright legal line. This story demands a careful but firm conclusion. A pregnancy ended a family endured grief, and a community confronted the painful intersection of addiction medicine and criminal law. The jury's verdict holds Brittney Poolaw accountable under Oklahoma statute and accountability matters. At the same time, the case underscores a warning that belongs in the public square. Substance use during pregnancy is dangerous, and seeking help early is essential. Nothing in these facts warrants sympathy for unlawful conduct, and nothing should dull the devastation that follows when responsibility is abandoned. Justice, to be worthy of its name, must be both precise and principled, protecting the vulnerable, honoring evidence, and insisting that personal choices never place a life, born or unborn, in jeopardy. 11. Amy Leann Hall. Amy Leann Hall was in her early 40s, a mother living in rural Okmulgee County, when a case of unimaginable family betrayal thrust her into the national spotlight. In the pre-dawn darkness of early November of 2018, inside a modest home on Muskogee Nation land, she moved from room to room and changed the course of 3 young lives. Later, in federal court, she would admit to killing 2 of her children and wounding a 3rd, accepting responsibility for an act that shook relatives, neighbors, and first responders alike. Behind the outward routine of custody disputes and small-town rhythms, something volatile was building. In statements described by reporters, Hall later claimed she believed she was protecting her children from an estranged husband, a claim authorities said was unsubstantiated. Prosecutors framed her mindset instead as a destructive mix of grievance and catastrophic judgment, not a delusion that excused what she chose to do. Whatever the private stresses in that household, the government argued they did not blur the line between fear and lethal intent. The crime itself unfolded in the quietest hours. Hall entered the bedroom of her son Cason Tolliver, 18 years old, and then the room shared by her daughters Chloe Tolliver, 16 years old, and a younger sister who survived. The teenagers were attacked as they slept. The younger girl, injured, pleaded with her mother and helped bring the violence to a stop. Hall fled, leading deputies on a brief chase before she was taken into custody. Cason died at the home. Chloe died later at a hospital. The youngest survived and would carry both physical and emotional scars into the courtroom years later. At first, the case was filed in state court. Then came the Supreme Court's McGirt decision, which confirmed that crimes involving Native people on reservation land fall under federal authority, because the killings occurred on Muskogee Nation land and involved a Native defendant and victims. Federal prosecutors took over. From that point, the investigation belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Okmulgee County Sheriff's Office, and the charges were brought in the Eastern District of Oklahoma. In late November of 2020, Hall pleaded guilty in federal court to 2 counts of murder in Indian country and to assault with intent to commit murder for the attack on her youngest daughter. The plea spared the surviving child a trial and placed the focus on sentencing and the formal record of what happened. In allocution, Hall expressed remorse. The government emphasized the deliberate nature of the acts and the vulnerability of the victims. Sentencing came in the spring of 2024. A federal judge imposed life imprisonment on each of the 2 murder counts to run at the same time and added a separate term of 240 months, 20 years for the assault charge. The United States Attorney's Office summarized the evidence, the jurisdictional path, and the sentence's concurrency, underlining that this punishment would keep Hall in federal custody for the rest of her natural life. National and local outlets reported the outcome with a mix of sorrow and outrage, echoing the grief voiced by extended family and community members. As for motive, prosecutors rejected the narrative of protection. In their telling, Hall acted out of anger and control, not defense. No clinical evaluation in the public record points to a psychosis that would erase culpability. Instead, the profile presented to the court was of a parent who planned and carried out lethal acts against sleeping children, followed by flight and eventual capture. The law calibrated to shield the most defenseless treated that sequence as the gravest breach of duty. This story ends as it must with a clear moral judgment. 2 teenagers, Kaysen and Chloe, were loved, hopeful, and entitled to safety in their own home. Their younger sister will live with what she witnessed and survived. Whatever storms raged in that family, nothing can justify turning a weapon on one's children. The federal court's sentence speaks with necessary force. Society will defend the innocent, hold the guilty to account, and refuse any narrative that seeks to recast deliberate harm as protection. Justice cannot restore what was taken, but it can stand unwavering for the value of those lives and for the community left to mourn them. 12. Brenda E. Andrew. Brenda E. Andrew was a stay-at-home mother from Oklahoma City, known in her church as a Sunday school teacher and in her neighborhood as a soft-spoken parent. In public, she presented a picture of stability, married to her high school sweetheart, Robert Dale Andrew, raising 2 children, and active in a tight congregational circle. But behind that image, prosecutors later said the marriage was unraveling. She was in her late 30s when the relationship broke apart, and she began an affair with a fellow church member and insurance agent named James Pavat, a man who had recently helped the family arrange substantial life insurance coverage. Friends would recall shifts in Brenda's demeanor and a growing distance between the spouses, warning signs that something darker might be taking shape. What pushed her toward the crime, according to the state, was a convergence of resentment, romance, and money. Evidence at trial traced a secret relationship that intensified as the marriage faltered. Prosecutors described jealousy and control, and they pointed to financial motives tied to a policy worth nearly $1 million. There were also claims of earlier plotting talk of removing Robert as beneficiary, mixed messages about who controlled the policy, and a prior incident in which his car's brake lines were found damaged. Whether those acts were rehearsal or intimidation, the overall picture suggested escalation rather than a single impulsive moment. The killing unfolded on a November evening in the early 2000s inside the Andrews' suburban garage. Robert had come by to pick up the children and, as planned, to help relight a furnace pilot. What happened next was the state's central narrative as he bent to the task. An ambush in the garage ended his life. Brenda herself sustained a superficial wound, and she phoned 911 to report masked intruders. To officers first on scene, the story raised as many questions as it answered. The tale of strangers slipping away into the night did not match what detectives began to find in the home and in the couple's recent history. The investigation moved quickly from the idea of a break-in to a theory of conspiracy. Detectives learned of Brenda's affair with Pavat and of the recent policy on Robert's life. Friends told investigators that Robert had grown fearful and suspicious. When warrants were issued, Brenda and Pavat had vanished. After a period on the run that crossed into Mexico, the pair were arrested at the border and returned to Oklahoma to stand trial. Pavat was tried first and convicted of murder and conspiracy. Brenda followed, facing a jury that heard about the affair, the insurance policy, the flight, and the staging of a false intruder story. The panel rejected her claims and found her guilty of murder in the first degree and of conspiracy to commit murder. The court imposed a death sentence and an additional term for the conspiracy count. The state's portrait of her psychology was stark. She was not, they argued, a panicked spouse or a bystander swept along by someone else's plan. She was a calculating participant who saw in Pavitt a partner and in the policy a payoff, who sought to shape the scene by wounding herself and invoking phantom attackers. Defense efforts to shift blame onto Pavitt or recast the shooting as something other than a planned act could not overcome the trail of preparation and the attempts to mislead. This case deserves a clear moral verdict beyond the legal one. Robert Andrew was a husband and a father who deserved safety in his own home and honesty from the person he trusted most. The evidence showed betrayal layered upon betrayal of vows of community and of the children left behind. Whatever unhappiness lived inside that marriage, it could never justify taking a life for money or for a new start with a lover. The court's judgment stands as a necessary statement of values. We do not tolerate killing for profit. We do not accept lies in place of accountability, and we honor victims by insisting that justice be firm, unambiguous, and complete. 13. Sandra Camille Bridewell. Sandra Camille Powers Bridewell moved through Dallas society with practiced charm, a poised hostess and mother who seemed to float from church circles to charity chatter with ease. In private, friends and reporters would later say she cultivated wealthy companions and grand promises. By the early 80s, she was a twice-married Highland Park socialite known for expensive tastes and a talent for landing on her feet. She had 3 daughters from her first marriage, a second husband who died of cancer, and a public image burnished by manners and style. That image would fracture as questions piled up around 2 sudden deaths linked to her orbit, and as a paper trail of cons and stolen identities surfaced across several states. Those who tried to explain her trajectory pointed to appetite and opportunism rather than trauma documented in a clinical file. Magazine investigations and interviews describe a pattern intimacy as leverage borrowed prestige and money problems that never seemed to end. The portrait that emerges is not of a momentary snap, but of escalating manipulation, moving from borrowed funds to bold reinventions of self, and eventually to suspicions about whether deceit had been paired with something far worse. Whatever the private stories she told about hardship or destiny, the consistent thread was control, not collapse. In mid-June of 1982, her close friend Mary Elizabeth, known as Betsy Bagwell, was found shot in her Mercedes at Dallas Love Field. The death was ruled a suicide. The weapon was a small-caliber revolver. Bridewell had spent time with her that day and was widely considered the last person to see her alive. The ruling never quieted doubts. Private investigators and journalists noted the absence of a note and the strained triangle of friendship that had formed as Bridewell leaned on the Bagwells during her husband's illness and after his death. Officially, the case stayed closed. Unofficially, whispers followed Bridewell from parlor to parlor. 3 years later, in early December of 1985, Bridewell's new husband, Alan Rehrig, a young mortgage employee who had fallen for her whirlwind allure, was discovered shot in an abandoned vehicle in Oklahoma City. Detectives believed the body had been driven from elsewhere. Bridewell became the focus of suspicion but was never charged. Reporters would later call her the Black Widow of Highland Park, a moniker fed by the unsolved nature of Rehrig's killing and the eerie echo of earlier tragedy. The grief of Rehrig's family hardened into a decades-long plea for answers. While homicide charges never materialized, financial crimes did. After years of moving between states under variations of her name, she surfaced on the North Carolina coast, ingratiating herself with an elderly widow while, according to prosecutors, redirecting mail draining accounts and living off a missionary persona. Arrested in a Charlotte sting, she ultimately pleaded guilty in federal court to aggravated identity theft. News accounts and a Justice Department release detail the terms of prison sentence measured in 2 years, a significant fine, court-ordered restitution, and supervised release after custody. For the first time, the woman long suspected in 2 deaths was convicted not for murder, but for stealing a life on paper. Psychologically, the public record sketches a confidence artist more than a killer diagnosed by experts. Writers and former investigators describe a practiced blend of charm and calculation, a willingness to invent biographies and to tap faith or pity when it opened doors. In the unsolved deaths, authorities and journalists alike stop short of certainty, but they trace motive lines that run through money reinvention and control. The courts did not find murder beyond a reasonable doubt. They did find identity theft beyond dispute. The closing truth here must be careful and firm. Betsy Bagwell and Alan Rarig were people not plot points, loved, mourned, and still the subjects of aching questions. Sandra Bridewell has never been convicted of killing anyone. The law requires that distinction, and it matters. But the con that led to her federal conviction shows a pattern of predation that harmed lives and hollowed trust. If she had no role in the deaths, then justice still waits for whoever did. If she did, then evasion has so far outpaced proof. Either way, the lesson is unambiguous: charisma is not character, and communities must protect the vulnerable from financial exploitation, from manipulation, and when evidence allows, from those who would take far more than money and reputation. 14. Marilyn Kay Plantz. Marilyn Kay Plantz was a homemaker and Sunday school teacher living in Midwest City, Oklahoma, 27 years old, when prosecutors said she set in motion a plot to kill her husband, James Plantz. To neighbors, the couple looked steady and conventional, raising 2 children in a quiet subdivision, while James worked nights at a major Oklahoma City newspaper. Friends later told reporters they had seen strains, but nothing that foretold what would come next. Beneath the suburban routine, prosecutors said she was entangled in an affair with a teenage boyfriend and dreaming of a new life paid for by insurance money. The slide toward murder, as the state reconstructed it, was not a sudden snap, but a series of choices. Financial pressure, marital conflict, and an infatuation with a much younger lover, William Clifford Bryson, blended into a volatile mix. Investigators found no clinical diagnosis that could explain away personal responsibility. Instead, witnesses recalled talk of money and plans. Prosecutors said she discussed how a death might look like an accident, and that she positioned life insurance, about $300,000, as the key to freedom. Whatever private resentments lived in the home, the state argued they hardened into premeditation. The crime unfolded in late August of the late 1980s. James came home from an overnight shift, walked into his house, and was ambushed by Bryson and his friend Clinton Eugene McKimball. The children were asleep down the hall. Marilyn was in the house. The attackers used baseball bats taken from the family home. When the scene failed to resemble an accident, the plan escalated. James was moved to his pickup and driven to a remote spot on the edge of the county where the vehicle and the man inside were set on fire, in an attempt to erase the assault and stage a crash. It was a sequence of acts that, without lingering on detail, conveys the chilling control at the heart of the state's case. Detectives quickly traced the crime back to the household. They recovered evidence from the home, took statements from acquaintances, and pulled at threads that led to the teenage boyfriend and his associate. McKimball accepted a deal for a life sentence and testified about planning and aftermath. Bryson and Marilyn were tried together. Jurors heard about the affair, the insurance efforts to make the killing look accidental, and the cool activity inside the home after James was attacked. The panel convicted Marilyn of murder in the first-degree conspiracy, solicitation, and arson, and a judge imposed a death sentence. Years of appeals did not alter the outcome. In early May of the early 2000s, the state of Oklahoma carried out the sentence by lethal injection. Members of James's family, who had endured hearings delays and anniversaries, said the legal conclusion could not restore their brother and father, but it affirmed the truth they had lived with since the night he died. In court, prosecutors described Marilyn's psychology as greed harnessed to manipulation, a willingness to turn a husband into a means to an end and to recruit impressionable teenagers to carry it out. They emphasized her role as planner and participant, not a bystander swept along. The defense suggested marital abuse and fear, but jurors did not find that narrative credible against the evidence of preparation, recruitment, and attempted staging. This story demands a firm moral conclusion. James Plantz was a father and a son who deserved safety in his own home and honesty from his spouse. The choices made against him, rooted in money betrayal and calculated deceit, broke that most basic duty. Whatever unhappiness or financial worry lived inside the marriage, none of it can justify turning a partner's life into a payout. The verdict and sentence stand as a clear statement of values. People are not disposable. Love is not a contract to be cashed, and when someone treats it that way, justice must answer with certainty and resolve.